Hi, let's summarize what we've learned. We have learned the most basic fact about iOS. It is written in Objective-C. So we have learned how to use Objective-C to write apps for iPhone specifically. But you can take the information you have learned in this course and apply it to the iPad, to the iPod Touch. We've learned how to work with controls and their view controllers to perform actions and set values. So we perform actions using the IBAction flag. We set values using properties that we make with a UI outlet, IB outlet. Maybe I need to look at what I've learned lately. We've looked at those properties, using those in the class to refer to both ibars and to controls on the view. And we've looked at synthesizing those properties, which automates the creation of getters and setters. And of course, if we write a new getter or a new setter after we've synthesized, the new getter that we have written will be used instead of the automatically generated getter and setter. We've learned some best practice development for iPhone using what we call a model view controller design pattern. We've talked about using target action to relay messages from controls to their target object. And we've also talked about delegation and a couple of related techniques to delegation to make one object perform tasks on behalf of another object. You can also combine these. You can actually set a target to some object's delegate class. So there's a lot of interesting ways that you can combine target action and delegation within the context of Model View Controller. Don't be afraid to experiment. If it doesn't work, you'll learn something from that as well. We've also talked a little bit about categories. We can add methods to a class even if we don't have the implementation of that class in front of us. So using a category is a very powerful tool. We've talked about using or adding categories to these plistable objects. You can add a category to NS object if you want to. It doesn't matter whether or not you have the source code for that class available. We've talked about some of these view controller subclasses, the tab bar controller, the navigation controller, to organize user interfaces in a nice way that doesn't take away but adds to the user experience. We've talked quite a bit about UI Table View Controller, displaying a list of items from a plistable object, adding and deleting items from rows in the table view, and performing tasks when a particular item is tapped. And we've talked about the segue to get from one view controller to another, and preparing for a segue, and setting delegates within a segue. Because when we use storyboards, the only way to set a delegate on a class is within the prepare for segue method. We've talked about that as well. We talked about grouped table views and using headers for each group. And there's also some other things that we haven't talked about there. You can make a footer for each group. I referred to being able to make an indexed table view, and we can do that as well. SQLite is a lightweight serverless database that we can use as a model for an app, and we've discussed using SQLite. We've talked about recording and playing audio and video files, and also the limitations of the simulator as opposed to an actual device. We can record and play back an audio file in the simulator as long as we have a microphone and speakers on our Mac, but video we cannot record on the simulator. We have to have an actual device to do that. We've talked about dynamically creating and drawing 2D graphics on UI views, which are subviews of the main view. And you can also dynamically create and draw 2D graphics on the main view if you have subclassed a UI view and made it the view controller's view. We can move UI views about the screen using touch events, and we did that in the last section of Unit 11. There is more to explore with touch events and other events, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So what's next? Well, we have a couple more videos in this unit. The best practices video will talk about the high-level design, building, implementation, and kind of the steps that you need to go through and think about as you're developing an app from scratch. And then the App Store video, the third video in this unit, talks about deploying an application on the App Store and the requirements for that. If you haven't already, I would strongly suggest that you join the iOS Developer Program. I don't get any money for this. I'm just saying that it is a very good value for $99 a year. Developer.apple.com is where you would go to join up. The $99 yearly fee gets you a lot of stuff. It gets you access to the entire iOS SDK. It gets you the presentation materials from the yearly Worldwide Developer Conference in Cupertino, California. And this is a huge value. That's worth $99 right there. Some of the stuff is not tremendously valuable, but there is a wealth of information, not only about iOS, but about Apple roadmaps going forward, about specific SDK concepts that they're coming up with, and about the next version of iOS, which is really what you're in it for, and you can gain a wealth of knowledge and prepare yourself for the next version of iOS that will be released. You also get early access to the preview and the beta versions of both Xcode and the SDK. And by early access, I mean months in advance. Usually, you start getting the beta versions of the SDK and Xcode for the next major version of iOS at least 3 months in advance. You get access to the developer forums. You get also the ability to test on actual devices instead of just testing in the simulator. And this is crucial if you're developing an application that will, in part at least, not run in the simulator. If you're developing for iPhone, you should always test your application against what happens when the phone rings, because that is an interruption of the flow of your application. So that, at least, is crucial to test on an actual iPhone before you deploy an app. You also have the ability to distribute apps on the App Store. And you also get code-level technical support from Apple for your own code. So this is a huge value. And at $99 a year, if you're going to be serious about developing for iOS and deploying apps on the App Store, certainly, then you really should join the iOS Developer Program. We've learned a whole lot about iOS, but there's a lot more that we haven't talked about. So look at your documentation. Also look online, look at developer.apple.com for some documentation about the following stuff. Look at blocks. Code blocks are sort of pointer to a function. Even we can have a pointer to a nameless function, like a Lambda function, that is gaining wider use with each new version of iOS. Blocks are being used certainly in Grand Central Dispatch that we're about to talk about. Also in animation techniques. Blocks, it seems that Apple keeps adding more and more stuff that will happen in blocks. So look up some block information. Look up Grand Central Dispatch. This is huge. This presents a single API for multi-threaded apps. So we dispatch threads out, and again, we do things within blocks to get the information from the thread as it comes back, to set information in the thread. So Grand Central Dispatch is nearly a whole course of its own. There's also Core Data that I haven't listed here. Core Data is another way to save application state and to save the model out. And there is a big, within the IDE, within the Xcode IDE, there is a really nice way to set up how those objects get saved. There's a SQL-like interface, and not SQLite, but SQL-like interface for our objects to be saved out. So Core Data is another thing to look at. And in a large application with much data in the model, Core Data may be the best way to go. There's also OpenGL ES. This is a mobile port of OpenGL 3D, the graphics library for OpenGL 3D, that's available on mobile devices, iOS and Android devices. There's also accelerometers, there's gravimeters, there's gesture recognizers. That list goes on and on and on. But probably the most important thing, the next step that you need to think about, is to keep learning. We've looked at the current version of iOS, but the fact is that Apple tends to change the world with each next version of iOS, and they have released a new major version each year since 2007. We're going to continue to update our course material with each update, so stay tuned and watch this space, because when things change, you want to know what those changes are, how to apply them, and how to best leverage your skills and knowledge to put apps on the App Store and, quite frankly, make a lot of money. Thank you very much.